3 days ago, something happened in the North Atlantic that changes everything about the Venezuela crisis. A Venezuelan oil tanker being chased by U.S. Coast Guard vessels painted a Russian flag on its hull, changed its name, and suddenly became a Russian ship. And Russia recognized it, made it official, sent a submarine and naval warships to escort it. Now you have American military ships on one side, Russian military ships on the other side, both surrounding the same oil tanker 230 miles off the coast of Ireland, both committed to opposite objectives, both following orders that can't be compromised. This isn't Venezuela anymore. This is a direct US-Russia military confrontation. And it started because America's blockade, the one that was supposed to stop Venezuelan oil from leaving, is completely failing. Today, I'm going to show you what's actually happening right now. Not what happened last week when headlines were screaming about Maduro's capture, but what's unfolding today across the Atlantic Ocean, along the Colombian border, and inside diplomatic meetings where countries are choosing sides, because 16 oil tankers just escaped the blockade. Russia is protecting Venezuelan ships under its flag, and America's closest allies in Latin America are publicly condemning the whole operation. The blockade that was supposed to work isn't working, and the consequences are spreading faster than anyone in Washington expected. Let me show you how this happened. On December 16th, President Trump announced what he called a total and complete blockade of Venezuelan oil. He posted that Venezuela was completely surrounded by the largest armada ever assembled in South America. The language was dramatic. The execution, not so much. According to multiple tracking services, tanker trackers, COM, Windward Maritime AI, and analysis from Bloomberg and the New York Times, at least 16 oil tankers have successfully escaped the blockade since January 3rd. 16 isn't a couple of ships slipping through. That's a coordinated mass exodus. These ships carried approximately 4 million barrels of crude oil that definitely left Venezuelan waters. Another 12 vessels, carrying an estimated 8 million additional barrels, were tracked leaving Venezuelan ports in what appears to have been a wholesale synchronized departure. Samir Madani, co-founder of Tanker Trackers, COM, said the timing was striking. All 16 vessels rushed to leave immediately after Maduro was captured. They happened straight after the operation, and could only have been pulled off if they were done in a wholesale, coordinated manner. So what we're watching is not a functioning blockade. What we're watching is a game of hide and seek, where the ships are actually quite good at hiding. These are what intelligence agencies call dark fleet tankers, ships that operate outside normal rules. They turn off their tracking transponders, the systems that are supposed to broadcast location to prevent collisions, or they fake their locations, making it appear they're somewhere completely different, sometimes oceans away. According to Reuters, the global dark fleet consists of more than 1,400 tankers. Over 920 of them are under sanctions from the United States, Britain, or the European Union. But here's the problem. Only 40% of the dark fleet ships serving Venezuela are actually under U.S. sanctions. That means 60% of them, hundreds of vessels, fall completely outside the scope of Trump's blockade order. So when the administration says they're enforcing a complete blockade, what they are really saying is they are trying to intercept a subset of ships specifically designed to avoid detection. The U.S. has successfully seized 2 tankers, the Skipper in mid-December and the Sentries in late December. Both seizures involved Coast Guard teams, Marine Corps Special Operations personnel, and helicopters launched from aircraft carriers. But 2 seizures out of potentially dozens of attempts, that's not a blockade, that's a disruption. And the difference matters because Venezuela's oil exports are the lifeblood of its economy. Oil accounts for nearly 90% of the country's export revenues. If the blockade were actually working, if tankers couldn't leave, Venezuela's economy would collapse within weeks. But that's not happening. Production has slowed, yes. Some tankers are stuck in port, but oil is still moving. Revenue is still flowing. The system is adapting faster than the blockade can contain it. Now let me tell you about the ship that turned this into a US-Russia confrontation. The ship is called the Marinara now. It used to be called the Belot 1. It's a very large crude carrier, in shipping terminology, a VLCC. These are massive vessels. This one was previously registered in Panama. The U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned this ship back in 2024 under President Biden for involvement in Iranian oil trading, so it was already on America's target list. In December, as U.S. forces closed in, the ship's operators did something creative. They painted a Russian flag on the hull, they changed the ship's name to Marinara, they re-registered the vessel under Russian Maritime Authority, and Russia made it official. They recognized the ship as a Russian-flagged vessel operating under their protection. This creates a massive problem. Seizing a ship flying a false flag, pretending to be from a country where it is not registered, that's one thing. But seizing a ship that's actually registered with a recognized government, that's a diplomatic incident. The Marinara was last tracked 230 miles off the coast of Ireland. U.S. Coast Guard vessels were in pursuit. U.S. Navy P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, the kind typically used for submarine hunting and long-range surveillance, were flying patterns off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. KC-135 aerial refueling tankers were in the area, C-130 transports, U-28 special operations aircraft. This wasn't casual monitoring. This was preparation for an interdiction operation. Then, Russia sent a submarine and surface vessels to escort the tanker. 2 U.S. officials confirmed this to CBS News. The Wall Street Journal reported it first. Suddenly, what started as a law enforcement operation became something completely different. U.S. military assets and Russian military assets in the same location, both operating under orders, both committed to incompatible objectives. The United States wants to seize the tanker. Russia is escorting it to prevent seizure. This isn't a standoff. This is a confrontation with the potential to escalate rapidly if someone miscalculates. On Monday, President Trump was asked about the situation at Mar-a-Lago. He said, "It's moving along and we'll end up getting it. Yeah, we're actually pursuing it. Can you imagine? It came from the wrong location." But whether the U.S. will actually seize the Marinara now that Russian naval forces are involved? The administration hasn't said. Plans can change. Operations can be shelved. But here's what makes this worse. According to the Russian Maritime Register of Shipping, at least 3 other sanctioned oil tankers operating near Venezuela have recently changed their flags to Russia. This isn't one ship trying a desperate tactic. This is a new strategy. Tankers evading U.S. sanctions by seeking Russian protection, and Russia is willing to provide it. Every future interdiction attempt could now involve Russian forces. Every seizure could become a diplomatic crisis. The U.S. blockade, already struggling to enforce compliance, now faces a geopolitical complication that makes enforcement significantly harder. While the tanker drama plays out in the Atlantic, another crisis is building on land. Colombian President Gustavo Petro mobilized security forces along the 2,219-kilometer border with Venezuela. He deployed additional troops, activated emergency protocols, and made a statement that got attention across the entire region. Petro said, "An attack on Venezuela is an attack on Latin America." He condemned the U.S. strikes. He warned that Colombia would not tolerate spillover from instability next door. Now, Colombia is a U.S. ally. It receives significant military aid. It cooperates on drug enforcement. Colombia has been one of Washington's most reliable partners in the hemisphere for decades. But Petro, a former leftist guerrilla, has always been ideologically different from previous Colombian leaders. He's criticized U.S. policy before, called for rethinking the war on drugs, pushed for regional solutions to regional problems. Now he's positioning Colombia as a defender of Venezuelan sovereignty. Not Maduro's government necessarily, but Venezuela's right to exist without foreign military intervention. This matters because Colombia shares more than a border with Venezuela. It shares communities. Families live on both sides. Trade flows both ways. And millions of refugees have crossed into Colombia over the past decade, fleeing Venezuela's economic collapse. If Venezuela descends into chaos, if there's a power vacuum, if armed groups start operating more freely, Colombia absorbs the consequences. More migration, cross-border violence, destabilized drug trafficking routes. So Petro's mobilization isn't just symbolic, it's practical. He's preparing for scenarios where Venezuelan instability threatens Colombian security. And he's making it clear that Colombia will not support military actions that make those scenarios more likely. But there's another layer. By condemning the U.S. operation and positioning Colombia as a defender of sovereignty, Petro is also signaling to other Latin American countries, we need to stand together. We need to make clear that unilateral military action in our region is unacceptable. And that message is resonating. This is where the Venezuela crisis becomes something bigger, because the regional reaction isn't scattered, it's coordinated. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay issued a joint statement, not individual condemnations. A joint statement. That's significant. That's 6 countries, some left-leaning, some centrist, one European, speaking with one voice, saying the same thing. This was a violation of sovereignty. This sets a dangerous precedent. This cannot be normalized. Brazilian President Lula da Silva went further. He said the U.S. strikes crossed an unacceptable line, called on the United Nations to act. He stated, attacking countries in flagrant violation of international law is the first step toward a world of violence, chaos, and instability. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum condemned the military action as a threat to regional stability. She emphasized that unilateral interventions jeopardize the entire hemisphere. And she did this while simultaneously working to maintain cooperation with Washington on border security, trade, and migration. This is diplomatic tightrope walking. Condemn the Venezuela operation, but don't rupture the broader relationship. Chile's government issued a statement emphasizing respect for international law and the UN Charter. Uruguay echoed similar concerns. Spain, a European voice with deep historical ties to Latin America, said it does not recognize unilateral interventions that violate international law. This is a bloc response, and it reflects something that was untrue a decade ago. Latin American countries are more willing to coordinate, more willing to push back against U.S. pressure, more willing to say they have their own interests that don't always align with Washington's. Part of this is ideological. Several current governments lean left or center-left and are skeptical of U.S. military action. They remember past interventions, Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, Panama, and they see echoes of that history in Venezuela. But part of this is also practical. China is now the largest trading partner for most of South America. Chinese investment has built ports, roads, energy infrastructure across the continent. Latin American countries now have alternatives. They're not as economically dependent on the United States as they once were. So when Washington acts unilaterally, ignores international institutions, uses military force without multilateral consensus, these countries can afford to object. They can coordinate. They can say, this is not acceptable. That shift from individual complaints to coordinated regional pushback is a structural change that won't disappear when the Venezuela crisis fades from headlines. On December 20th, the UN Security Council held an emergency session to discuss the Venezuela situation. Multiple countries raised concerns about maritime law and sovereignty. Some countries, Panama and Argentina, supported the U.S. Others condemned it. China's representatives stated, the U.S. action seriously violates international law and Venezuela's sovereignty and threatens peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean. Russia called it lawlessness in the Caribbean Sea, where long-forgotten piracy and banditry are being revived. Iran's foreign ministry called the tanker seizures, acts of piracy with no legal basis under international law. Now, you can dismiss these statements as predictable. Russia, China, Iran are adversaries, so of course they criticize U.S. actions. But here's the point. The United States is losing the narrative battle. Even countries that have engaged in their own violations of international law, Russia and Ukraine, China's maritime claims in the South China Sea, can now point to Venezuela and say, see, the U.S. doesn't respect the rules either. This is the credibility problem. When the United States violates the principles it claims to defend, it undermines its ability to hold other countries accountable. And that matters because international law only works if there's a shared sense that it applies to everyone. If it only constrains the weak while the powerful do as they please, it's not law, it's just the preferences of the powerful. The UN Secretary General issued a statement expressing deep alarm and warning that the Venezuela operation sets a dangerous precedent for international norms. He didn't say it was illegal. He didn't call for sanctions. He just expressed concern. Because that's what the UN Secretary General does when a major power violates the Charter. He expresses concern and hopes someone listens. But the structural problem remains. The United States holds veto power at the Security Council, so any resolution condemning the action will be blocked. The International Court of Justice has no jurisdiction over the U.S. in this matter. The Organization of American States is divided and lacks enforcement power, so functionally there are no consequences. The U.S. can conduct this operation, other countries can condemn it, and nothing changes except perception, except trust, except the willingness of other countries to cooperate with Washington on future issues. Those things erode slowly, but once they're gone, rebuilding them takes decades. Let's talk about what this blockade, however imperfect, is actually doing to oil markets. Venezuelan oil production has been disrupted, not stopped, but slowed. According to Windward Maritime AI, at least 16 tankers that arrived to load crude or discharge naphtha, a product used to help export Venezuela's thick, heavy crude, are now stuck in Venezuelan ports. Some vessels are being used as floating storage because they can't leave territorial waters without risking seizure. When storage is full, production has to slow. You can't keep pumping oil if you have nowhere to put it. This creates economic pressure on the Venezuelan government. Less oil exported means less revenue. Less revenue means less ability to pay government salaries, maintain services, or buy political loyalty. But it's not crippling, not yet, because the dark fleet is still operating. Ships are still evading the blockade. And some buyers, primarily China, are still willing to purchase Venezuelan oil despite the risks. According to a CEIC economic data, Venezuela exported more than 655,000 barrels per day in 2024. That's down significantly from peak production in the early 2000s, but it's still substantial. The blockade has disrupted some of that flow, but it hasn't stopped it. The bigger question is, what happens if the U.S. escalates further? If Washington starts seizing ships in international waters more aggressively? If it pressures insurance companies to deny coverage for any vessel that goes near Venezuela? If it imposes secondary sanctions on banks that handle payments for Venezuelan oil? Then the economic pressure increases dramatically. But each of those steps also increases the geopolitical cost. Seizing ships creates confrontations with Russia. Pressuring insurers disrupts global maritime commerce. Secondary sanctions alienate allies who don't want their banks cut off from dollar-based systems. This is the dilemma. The US can tighten the blockade, but tightening the blockade means more confrontations, more diplomatic costs, and more incentive for other countries to build systems that don't depend on US approval. Meanwhile, global oil markets have remained relatively calm. Prices didn't spike. Why? Because Venezuela's current production, less than 1 million barrels per day, is small enough that its removal doesn't materially affect global supply. But the precedent matters. If the US can blockade Venezuela, can it blockade Iran? Russia? What happens when sanctions enforcement becomes naval warfare in all but name? Those are questions traders are starting to ask, and the answers will shape energy markets for years. Let me bring this together because it's important to understand where we actually are in this crisis. The Venezuela operation has evolved into something more complex than Washington anticipated. It's no longer just about removing Maduro. It's become a naval blockade struggling to enforce compliance, a diplomatic crisis with Russia involving submarines, a border security challenge for Colombia, a sovereignty issue uniting Latin American governments against the US, a test case for whether America can reshape a country without triggering broader consequences. And the early evidence suggests it cannot. The blockade is leaking, tankers are escaping, Russia is providing protection, Latin America is pushing back, the UN is expressing concern, the tools the US is using, sanctions, interdictions, naval patrols, are proving less effective than expected against adversaries who are adapting in real time. This doesn't mean the operation will fail. The US has enormous military and economic power. It can sustain pressure indefinitely. It can seize more ships, impose more sanctions, escalate. But escalation has costs, and those costs are mounting. Trust with regional partners is eroding. Confrontations with Russia are increasing. The precedent being set that powerful nations can use force to achieve their objectives is one that will be cited by others. China is watching. Every country with resources the US might want is watching. And they're all drawing the same conclusion. Reduce dependence on American systems. Diversify. Hedge. This is the strategic cost that does not show up in Pentagon briefings. The erosion of soft power, the incentive for other countries to build alternatives, the transformation of the international system from one based on rules to one based on power. Once that transformation is complete, once everyone accepts that power determines outcomes, the system becomes much less stable because power is contested. Rules can create order. Power creates competition. The Venezuela crisis was supposed to be contained. A quick operation to remove Maduro, install a cooperative government, stabilize oil flows, and move on. But containment failed. The crisis is expanding geographically, diplomatically, and economically. It's now a naval standoff in the North Atlantic, a border mobilization in Colombia, a diplomatic fracture across Latin America, a test case for international law, a demonstration of the limits of American power. The blockade continues, the tanker chase continues, the diplomatic fallout spreads. And somewhere in the North Atlantic, a Russian submarine escorts an oil tanker while U.S. naval assets watch and calculate. Both sides are committed. Both sides are following orders. Both sides are wondering what happens if someone makes the wrong move. That's where we are right now. The story isn't over. It's evolving. And the choices being made in the next few weeks will determine whether this crisis gets contained or whether it becomes something much larger. This isn't the story you saw on the news last week. This is the story unfolding right now. Drop a comment below. What do you think happens next? Does the U.S. back down on the Marinara? Does Russia keep protecting Venezuelan tankers? Does Latin America's unity hold? And subscribe because I'll be tracking every development as this situation evolves. The next update could come in days or hours. This is moving fast. History doesn't give us neat endings. It gives us moments of tension where the outcome isn't decided yet, where choices matter, where the future is still being written. We're in one of those moments right now. Thanks for watching.